I was asked to give a talk in relations to this Robocop, DTU Robocop. So what I'll tell you a little bit about is evolutionary robotics, a brief introduction to evolutionary robotics. So as you may know, sort of natural evolution is of course very much it goes back to Charles Darwin, right, with natural selection and so forth. And these are some of the principles that are being tried to be transferred and applied in evolutionary robotics research field. So this is a different way to design robots, where you are very much inspired by biological evolutionary processes in order to design them in a different way than you usually do, where usually, I mean, someone sits and programs the robot, but this is using evolutionary technique in order to automatically design the robot's controller and maybe also the shape and the morphology of the robot, which means basically the body shape of the robot. And the reason for doing this is it enables sometimes the system to find better solutions than humans designers are able to do. I mean, we all have biases as humans, so therefore using genetic algorithms doesn't have any biases towards specific things like, for example, symmetry. So therefore it's able to find different and maybe also better solutions than human designers. And this is also a research field which is very much interested in sort of the long-term dream of having completely autonomous robots that are able to live and evolve and learn and so forth by themselves, completely independent from humans. So this is the long-term dream of artificial life. So the outline of this talk is like this. I'll tell you a little bit about evolutionary robotics, then I'll tell you a little bit about artificial neural networks, which are often used in this field. I will tell you a little bit about genetic algorithms, which are sort of the underlying algorithms, the standard algorithm for doing evolutionary robotics. And then I'll tell you, give you an example from the literature, a classic example of how to evolve a neural network controller for a robot using genetic algorithms. And then I'll very briefly show you a video how you can also apply to optimize not only or co-evolve not only the controller but also the body shape and how the robot looks like, where the sensor sits and so forth. So talking about evolutionary robotics, it's a little important just to be able to differentiate what we mean by evolution compared to learning first. So learning is something we do all the time. It's a very short time scale. From 1 minute to the next you learn something, and you do it throughout the whole lifetime of the robot. While evolution, it's long time scales. It's from one generation of a robot to another. It's something it's kind of like an inheritance from parents during generations of robots or animals. So typically evolutionary robotic process will look like this. You start with some random population of robots. These are called chromosomes in the literature, so this is kind of like our genes, which are somehow encoding the control of the robot. So you could imagine each of these are a different robot controller, for example, with a number of different numbers in them, basically an array of numbers. Then what you do is you take each of these and transfer it to the physical robot and let it evaluate for a period of time, and then you measure some sort of fitness based on this controller. So in this environment, it could be it should move around without hitting the walls. And if it hits the walls, it gets a negative reward. If it doesn't hit the walls, it gets a positive reward. So you take these controllers, put it in the robot, and do that periodically. And then when you're done evaluating all of them, you produce another generation of robots based on the fitness of the first generation. Okay? And you do this based on sort of the same type of reproduction mechanism that we know from ourselves, from biology. So it could be there's two parents that produce a child with some mechanism that is similar to the way DNA is copied from one generation to the next. And then you continue this process from one generation to the next, to the next, to the next, to the next, until you have evolved some population of robots that fits the performance criteria that you have set. So diving a little bit deeper into this, we can talk about a genetic algorithm, which is basically just an optimization algorithm inspired by biological evolution, where you have this population of individuals, and the fittest individuals somehow are able to allow to create the new population. each of the individual robots are encoded as a chromosome, and that chromosome could be, for example, a string of bits inside the computer, could be fixed points, it could be floating point values. So this might be a robot controller here, for example, an array of numbers somehow. So the genetic algorithm is doing, from one generation to the next, it's optimizing the fitness of the individuals in the population. So over time, over many generations, the average fitness and also the max fitness should increase over time compared to the fitness evaluation function. And this is the fitness function looks a little bit like this. It takes as input some specific individual encoded as a chromatin. It computes some number that gives an output which is assigned to each of the individuals. And of course, this fitness function doing evolutionary robotics is very much task dependent. So then what you do when you have assigned the fitness to each robot is you select the ones which you want to use for reproduction, and you can do this a number of different selection strategies, which I might not want to go through, but you can imagine, for example, like a roulette wheel, which is basically a probability dependent on the fitness function values. So you select with higher probability the ones that have higher fitness. So you select 2 of them and combine them. And the way you combine them is using these kinds of genetic operators. So the genetic operators are for example, crossover, where you take 2 chromosome parents, parent 1 and parent 2, and then you cut the chromosome somewhere and you split the 2 halves. And in that way you can create a new child chromosome, and then you apply mutation, which could be flipping a random bit in the chromosome. So now you have a slightly mutated sort of average of the parents, which is your new individual, which goes into the next generation of the generation. There's also some elitism, which is basically allowing some of the individuals to clone themselves from one generation to the next. So if you have like 5 best individuals in some generation, sometimes it makes sense just to clone them directly to the next one. So let me talk a little bit about artificial neural networks, which are very much used as a substrate for evolutionary robotics. So this is, again, sort of a simple computational model of artificial neural networks. Of course, the neurons we have around our brain, how do they communicate together, how do they collaborate, and then building some model based on that. And the model, well, the simplest form, I mean, of course, it varies a lot, right? So there's from extremely simple model to models that try to model the individual molecules of the neurons. But let me just sort of introduce the very simplest ones. So this is something called a feed-forward neural network, where you have an input layer. So in here, for example, your sensor values would go, and then those numbers are then transferred using these arrows and something called weights. So it's multiplied by something, it's put into another neuron, which is summing it up and doing a threshold based on this value here. And then so you feed in some numbers and another number come out based on this kind of artificial neural network model structure. So a little more detailed with this is you can have any kind of structure like this in a feed-forward neural network. You have some input layer, and what the individual modules do is they take all the values coming into them, like this one here is computing from each of these neurons, all the values coming into it, multiplying it by some weight number, which you can find up here. So x4 here, xj here, multiplied by the weight value, the sum of that, and then you compute the sum of this and put it inside something called a sigma function, which looks like this. So the x value here goes there, and this is a constant. And then you create the output of the neuron, which is then fed into the next neuron, for example. So this is very basic model of artificial neural networks. You can also have something called recurrent neural networks, but get a little closer to the biological things, where you can actually have more general connections between the different neurons. So you don't necessarily feed it forward, but it can be a sort of a more general graph structure of neurons. So in this case here, there's no input, but in this case here, this neural network would, if you measure the value of this neuron here, would be producing something like a sinus curve like this. So it has a, it's sort of, it has an, it has a memory of its previous state, and it has a time variant behavior. So there's a lot of good reasons to use artificial neural networks. One is, of course, it's biologically plausible. It's distributed parallel, and it shows tendencies of emergence, which is something you often really want in these kinds of systems. You can do, they're very appropriate for adaptation also, because you can apply something like genetic algorithms, which I'm going to show you how to do, or learning algorithms on top of these neural networks in order for the robot to learn something if the robot is controlled with a neural network. It provides a straightforward mapping between the sensors and the motor, which is of course a limitation, but it can also be an advantage sometimes. And with respect to optimization algorithms, it provides a smooth search page, which is really nice. So if you change the parameters of the neural network a little bit, sort of the behavior of the neural network doesn't change a lot, it changes a little, which is an advantage if you want to optimize the weight, for example. Robust to noise, it's basically a filter. And it has properties sort of, it's able to generalize from examples. So if you're training it based on specific examples, there's a very good probability that will be able to generalize those learnings to novel situations. So then how do you evolve using genetic algorithms and artificial neural network controller for a robot? So you can evolve a number of different things, like these weight values, these downs here. This could be typically encoded in the chromosome, but it could also be other things like how does the topology of the network look like? Is this one connected to that one, or doesn't that connection exist? Or maybe this one is directly connected to that one instead. The activation function, which was this, I showed you this sigmoid function. It could be other functions, and you could evolve which ones to use. Also, other examples is like you can learn use different learning rules, which the evolutionary algorithm could optimize on. This is a specific learning rule. So a very classic example from Dario Floriano's book in '96 here is this small Capera robot, which is basically a small round robot with 2 wheels, very similar to the robots you have here. Can drive around in a small arena like this. It has a number of sensors. These are proximity sensors here, which measures distance, and then also in the back it has some distance sensors, 2 wheels. And what they wanted to do here is they wanted it to explore, which means they wanted it to move around as much as possible, but they also wanted it not to hit the walls. So this was the behavior that they wanted to evolve. So they equipped it with a neural network that looks like this. So you have all the input neurons here. Then you only have 2 hidden neurons here, which are also controlling the motors directly. Okay, so the output of these motor neurons here are controlling the speed of the robot. That's it, right? So direct flare. Sorry, there's no other control strategies implemented in this. So this is 20 floating point values, which are the weights of these individual connections, which they're optimizing based on a genetic algorithm. So then they have to define a fitness function, and this looks like this. And it's really nice because it's kind of eternally evaluated, so the robot itself is able to determine its fitness. So what you have here is the speed of the wheels. So this is a term you want to optimize because you want the robot to move as fast as possible. This term here is the difference between the rotational speeds, which you want to minimize because it gives you turning. So you want to optimize forward movement, but minimize turning, because otherwise you easily get a robot that just spins around itself. And then finally, you want to optimize, well, you want to minimize proximity sensor value. So this is the value of the highest proximity sensor. So if you minimize that value, it means that you will stay as far away from the edges of the arena as possible. So this is the fitness function they used. Then they did an experiment like this. You have these different populations. You have this generation of robot controllers, these chromosomes, which are then transferred into a neural network, which is controlling a physical robot that is connected to a PC here. And then you do the evaluation, fitness evaluation and so forth, and you generate the new generations of robots in this very straightforward manner. So population size 80 individuals, so there are 80 robots they have to evaluate for each generation, and this takes around 40 minutes per generation because it's a physical robot in the loop. So this is a very typical graph of genetic algorithms. So you have the average performance. This is the fitness values here, the fitness, so average fitness over generations on this axis. So you see the average increase and the maximum increase, of course, larger. So what you can see here is that the robots in the beginning is performing much less compared to the final ones. And this is the trajectory of the best robot. So you can see it's able to move around in this arena quite safely. Well, you don't know what Breitenberg vehicles is, but this is a very, very simple robot that is which they use as a baseline test to compare with the genetic algorithms. And what they can see is that it's not just a Breitenberg vehicle which has been evolved, it's something else because it has a memory, so it's able to get unstuck if it's stuck in a specific situation. Yeah, so I just showed you how to evolve a robot controller based on artificial neural networks, and of course there are a number of reasons why this is a good idea, and there's also a lot of reasons why this is not a good idea. One of them is how to achieve open-ended evolution, because I mean, the previous example only works for this specific situation, but what we really want to do is you want to have robots that evolve over time, maybe change completely how they look like, kind of like us, kind of the way we have evolved from something completely different. So I'm not going to talk much about coevolution, but I am going to just mention what it is and then show you a video. So coevolution is this situation where you're not only controlling or optimizing the controller of the robot, but you're also optimizing how the robot looks like, you know, how many wheels it has, for example. And this is of course the idea that these things are very dependent on each other, and you know, the robot you start out with might not be the one you want in the end. So I'll show you a video of a very, very classic, famous example by Carl Sims in '94, who was the first to demonstrate coevolution in a simulator of these kinds of robots.
This demonstration shows virtual creatures that were evolved to perform specific tasks in simulated physical environments. Swimming speed was used to determine survival. Most of the creatures are results from independent evolutions. Some developed strategies similar to those in real life. Once they're evolved, multiple copies of these creatures can be made and simulated together in the same environment. The next group of creatures were evolved for their ability to move on a simulated land environment with gravity and friction. Some simple solutions with just 2 parts were found. Some seemed like they could use some assistance, while others were fairly efficient, such as this rowing-like behavior. Here is an odd cousin of the previous. A mutation caused him to tumble. Some creatures evolved to incorporate contact sensors in their control systems. Here is another inchworm-like creature that tends to go in circles. This was actually a creature first evolved for its ability to swim in water, then later put on land and evolved further. A successful sidewinding ability resulted. Here is one with a hopping style. The protrusions on its arms seemed to help prevent it from tipping over. This was the fastest, with a successful galloping-like stride. This group was evolved for their jumping ability. This group was evolved for their ability to adaptively follow a red light source. The resulting creatures are now being interacted with. A user is moving the light source around as the creature behaves. This one seems to flail randomly, but somehow still manages to approach the light. Perhaps it is mean to move the goal away just as it arrives. Here is one that has propeller-like fins which are tilted depending on the direction of the light. It can adaptively swim up or down very well. This final group of creatures was evolved for their ability to compete for control of a green cube. The creature closest to the cube at the end of a simulation is the winner. Here, a strategy first arose for simply tumbling towards the cube. Then one learned to block out his opponent. but then later one learned to overcome the obstacle by climbing over it. Some pinned down their opponents. Some covered the cube with protective arms. Others simply unfolded onto the cube. The success of a strategy is often highly dependent on the opponent. Here is a hockey-playing creature, which takes the cube away and wins by a large margin. Here are two similar hockey strategies battling it out, with appropriate gestures. This crab-like creature walks well, but often continues past the cube and instead seems to prefer beating up on his opponent. Against the arm, the crab seems to simply walk away. A successful strategy is this two-arm technique that swipes quickly in from the side and moves the cube over to a second arm. These are the final rounds of competition amongst the overall best. Finally, the seeker arm goes against the side swiper, but the cube is just out of reach.
So that was
this demonstration shows virtual creatures that were evolved.
So this was the very classic work by Carl Sims, 94, right? And of course, many people have tried to transfer this to physical robots and still are trying to do that. It's I'm not gonna tell you about the details of how it works, but it's basically, if you imagine these kind of graph structures that is being evolved and not necessarily encoded as a chromosome, but you have like a graph structure encoding that you can then cut in various places and transfer it from one to the other. And you have a graph structure both for the control and you have a graph structure for the morphology. And then you basically apply the same mechanisms that I've been talking about before. You take this genetic algorithm to optimize these graph structures, put it in the simulator and test how it works, and this is the kind of results you will get. So this is very much sort of what people are trying to do with in physical life within evolutionary robotics today. And just to summarize what I talked about, I introduced you to evolutionary robotics, genetic algorithms, and artificial networks, how to evolve an artificial network controller for using a genetic algorithm, and then I showed you this video about coevolution of morphology and control. So that's it for me, and if you have any questions, please ask.